in the 5th year of Nebuchadnezzar, you had some astrological event like an eclipse that fixes these certain dates to certain times, because there weren't eclipses in that portion of the world at this date, at this time, at any other time except for this particular date.
But as soon as we start putting a timeline in here, and we see, okay, there was real events connected to this kingdom and that kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar II, and that's when that happened. And now you can make these correlations,
right?
And it becomes much more interesting. And we need to be good historical students, that we are studying history, because that is what really helps us to verify the prophecies and verify our understanding and even validate the Bible as a true prophetic book. Hi everyone, welcome to another Truth Matters. I'm MacKenzie Drebit, here again with Matt Schanche. Matt, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we're kind of on this crusade in a way, and it's a long journey because we're tackling two things at the same time. We're tackling Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks, which is kind of this ongoing thing, which by the time we're done, we probably will have anywhere between 5 and 7 episodes covering it, because it's just that important that we get that in depth, because there's so much misunderstanding that's going to affect end time eschatology or end time flow of events for the world, but also how this relates to church and state uniting in America. All the stuff we talked about with Donald Trump in previous episodes and the evangelical power, like all these things are coming together. But the best way, in my opinion, and kind of the way that we go about things, is we want to understand what other people believe, because it's not just about sharing and kind of teaching what we understand the truth to be, but also understanding what others believe and how we can break these things down to determine whether they're true or not. So today, we're going to start the 70-week perspective from the Jewish perspective. And what I mean by the 70 weeks is not the whole thing, but when the decree starts and where those dates take us to based on the Jewish understanding of these things, and see if they kind of handle the weight of scrutiny as we go through and pick apart exactly how they determine and understand this prophecy.
Okay, well, before we start, let's have a quick word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you again that we can be here sharing your word. We ask that you'd be giving wisdom, and that these would be your words in our mouths and not our own, and that the people could be blessed by this study. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. So, the math of the 70 weeks of Daniel 9. So we really want to get into, as we've looked in previous episodes, the first one on this, and we'll try to link these in the description, because we know sometimes people are like, well, where's the first one and where's the second one? We'll try to keep all the links for everything related to this 70 weeks in the description, because the very first one, we had to determine when the book of Daniel was written. And once we established that, we could kind of move to the next portion, which is, what is the prophecy about? What does it entail from these different worldviews? Who are affected by it? And then now we're getting into the place of, okay, we have a basic understanding of what everybody thinks it's about. Now let's apply the math to fit what these interpretations are, because we're dealing with a prophetic time period that has a specific beginning and a specific end. And once we know what each view says the beginning and the end is, we can go back and look if that fits the time frame. And so we're going to do that by looking at the Judaism view today. As we said, 2.3 billion people in the world. And I would actually say it's the entire global population that's affected by this, because whether people outside of this 2.3 billion, which makes up these 4 groups, they're still going to be impacted by these things. Like the Donald Trump speech, like there's 380 some odd million Americans. They're not all Christian or Catholic or whatever, or Jewish. So even though he's talking to that group of people, the people who are not part of those belief systems, they're going to be impacted if laws are starting to be passed for the Christian worldview. So like, I'm underestimating the 2.3 billion
That's just
worldwide
the
population.
direct affected people.
And people who are interested in enough to write about what it means. Like, you're not going to find secular people writing about prophecy in Daniel.
Right.
But these four groups do write about prophecy in Daniel in one form or another, some less detailed, some more detailed. And so it's to me, it becomes vital to education if we want to understand this correctly, just how much this particular topic impacts the world and really why we're spending so much time on it and going so in depth.
Right.
Because at the end of it, I think what we're hoping is people could send the full playlist of 7 or whatever episodes to any worldview, and they'd be able to watch it and learn something from it and maybe challenge what they know and have some questions to go back and start engaging with people that they are learning from to see whether their understandings are actually correct or not. So we're going to do just a quick review because sometimes there are gaps between episodes. We're not doing all 7 in a row. I think in this case, we had a couple other church state episodes in between these. So we're going to try to just keep people up to speed and try to do that rather quickly so we can get into the meat and potatoes of the episode. So one of the main things that we did in the first 2 episodes on this was connecting Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, that the vision that we see of the 70 weeks is the beginning portion of the larger vision of the 2,300 days that's found in Daniel 8. Now, in kind of perusing through some of the comments in those past videos, I saw people making claims that, oh, this is totally off. The 2 visions aren't connected. The 2,300 days is a totally separate thing. But like, if you go back and watch our video, we literally put it side by side, what pieces are fulfilled in 8 and what's left, what wasn't talked about, and how we got to the portion of 9. So while I respect the people who disagree with that, they would have to present a body of evidence that would say that they were not connected in any way that would kind of overcome what we shared.
There's no new section between 8 and 9 where Daniel says that he's receiving a new vision or a new prophetic insight here. So it's just purely a continuation of that.
And the presence of Gabriel in both visions show that, because he said he came to give understanding in 8, and then he came back to finish the understanding in 9 from what was left over in 8, because the only thing he addresses in 9 is the one thing that's missing from 8. So it's like it's very difficult to separate those two things. So the vision consists mainly in 8 of the goat, the ram, the little horn, and the 2,300 days. We saw in 8, you get the meaning of the goat, you get the meaning of the ram, you get the meaning of the papacy in the little horn in the description of it, because it says Greece and it says Persia, but it doesn't say Rome, but it describes Rome, and there's only one power that fits.
Now, and one of the main reasons for that was there was no such thing called Rome yet.
I mean, this was hundreds of years before Greece, let alone Rome. But it did a good job of describing it in a way that there's only one power that could qualify to meet every qualification.
All the attributes there, there's only one entity that it could be, which was Rome.
Exactly. But what it doesn't give us in this whole thing, we see the goat handled, the ram handled, the little horn handled. It doesn't give us the start date for the 2,300 days, because you've got this great long prophecy that God is telling Daniel is important, otherwise it wouldn't be in the vision, but he never gives him an idea of when it starts. And in Daniel in 9 realizes that they're in the end of the 70-year prophecy from Jeremiah for the Babylonian captivity, which means he understood that there was a start date for when that 70 years had to start and an end date. And he had enough awareness to know that there was a start and an end. It wasn't a confusing thing. Why would it be any different for a start date and an end date for another time prophecy of the 2,300 years? So Daniel 9:23 through 27 finishes the interpretation of the vision. And what we see when we get there is Daniel 9:24 gives us the very start of this with the language, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. And we're going to, throughout this whole program, we've kind of picked one expert from each view, right? So we're not going to tell you what the Jews think on this. We're going to let Rabbi Ben Zion Kravitz tell us what the Jews think about this, because we're not in a place to be able to talk about what others believe from their viewpoint. So we always try to get sources. And he tells us that this prophecy also includes a description of events that would unfold if the Jewish people did not repent properly. So we all views agree that this 70 weeks is about the Jewish people and about the holy city, Jerusalem. And we see that in other episodes. All agree that the 70 weeks are 490 literal years. So there are like common points between all four views,
Yeah.
which is that these are 490 years. It's about the Jews and it's about the holy city in some capacity. Now, when you get into the details is when we notice the difference. But this is a good place for people to grasp and say, hey, there's no one saying that it's like 1,000 years or anything other than 490 literal years.
Right.
And we shared in one of the episodes that it's kind of interesting that in order to get to the 490 literal years, you have to use the day-year principle for Bible interpretation, when most often these groups outside of the Adventists don't use
that.
But they do in this prophecy. So that's just something to take note of. And I think is something that if you're witnessing to other people, ask them why you're using a day-year principle interpretation here, but not in other places. We've obviously talked at length about the desire for two specific groups to rebuild this third temple. And I would say the papacy's in here too, but it's more of a hidden hand than it is like an active, engaged hand like the Jewish power and the evangelical power.
Just a comment on the papacy is they usually operate that way anyways.
Yeah.
They use other armies, they use other entities to do their bidding, and then they're like, oh, we didn't do that.
Yeah.
They did that.
Yeah.
And so they do it in the background, and they do it, well, certain things are overtly done, but in this instance right now, it's mainly these two entities that are the ones pushing for it.
Yeah. And we've seen that with all the research and breakdowns that we've done in other episodes, that the evangelical power and the Jewish power are finding common ground over this third temple, even though they're for different reasons. The evangelicals want to bring in the Antichrist, not because they want the Antichrist to come, but because they believe they're going to be raptured away before the Antichrist comes. So they're trying to get all the prophetic pieces lined up, which includes building this temple, so they can be taken away, and then the rest of the world's just kind of up in arms. And we've seen a lot of people in our most recent video about this, like really harping on that,
Right.
Man, you guys are going to be disappointed when everyone's raptured away and you're still here.
Yep.
And my response to that is, I hate to say, the only disappointed ones are the ones who are expecting to be avoiding this whole situation, and they're not.
Gonna go through it.
And they're going to go through it, and then they're going to be like, well, what happens to their faith then? And they say, well, God wouldn't let his people go through such stuff. But he let the Israelites go through Egypt and Babylon. He let the reformers go through the Reformation time and the Dark Ages and the persecution there. He let the apostles go through being killed. He let Christ be strung up on the cross, because God's ways are infinitely higher than our ways. He knows what he's doing. But to say that he won't let his people go through those things is actually not in accordance with the history. And then on the Jewish side, the main reason is they want to usher in the Messiah too, but from a different viewpoint, because Jesus Christ to them is not the Messiah. They're waiting for
the first coming they're looking for, where the Christians are looking for a second coming.
Correct. And they think the third temple needs to be reinstituted for the sacrificial services, as we talked about before. The whole point of the sacrificial system was to point to one entity, to Christ. So like them starting to sacrifice heifers and things like that again is not. There's no value in that. That's why that system ended at the end of this 70 weeks. But we see that they're coming together to try to accomplish this goal for the same end goal, but for two separate kind of reasons. And we have the proof that the GOP's been going over to Israel on secret trips for a long time, that we saw Mike Johnson has spent a lot of time sharing his desire to support Israel in all of this. In the Trump speech, when he says, we're going to support Israel, it got one of the loudest ovations from the evangelical crowd. So like this whole theology is really at the center of it. And it's 100% based on Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks. And really what we're trying to expose here is like there's this threefold power system of dragon, beast, and false prophet. And their whole goal is false worship. And so as we're trying to pick through the weeds on what's happening here, we need to realize that the end goal is a conglomerate system that's all set up to have us worship under a false understanding. So if the 70 weeks is the premise for their whole 7-year end time antichrist tribulation rapture theology, and it's based on bad principles, well then it's part of what's going to make up this false worship system that deceives the whole world.
So then again, looking at this, we have the papacy, which is the mother, and then going down to Protestant America, which is the harlot daughters, And then we have this quote from Spalding and McGann, and I'll just read a little bit of here. We've read this before. I saw that the two-horned beast had a dragon's mouth. So again, this two-horned beast, which is a lamb-like beast, is going to speak like a dragon. Going down to the highlighted part, that the mother was not the daughters, but separate and distinct from them. The Protestant sects were next to come on the stage and act out the same mind that the mother had when she persecuted the saints.
Yeah.
So we're going to have this system happening again, and it's not to do with this 70 weeks being pushed forward, but this is where we see this 490 years. There's the similarities, like we mentioned, and where's the differences, and why are they acting out these different roles?
Yeah, and so we're tackling the Jewish view, we're going to tackle the mother's view, and we're going to tackle the daughter's views on all of this stuff. And we know there's going to be evangelicals and probably Catholics and maybe some Jewish people watching. And we're just asking to keep an open mind, because if what you are advocating is the truth, it should be able to withstand any level of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And so we're just simply taking a look at that now. And we saw in the last episode that Trump is being a major catalyst for this. This NRB speech we have now referenced quite a bit. We did a whole breakdown bit by bit.
If people haven't seen that, go back to
Please.
the last video and watch that,
Yeah.
because we break it down in detail.
Yeah, and he is acting as this catalyst for the evangelical and the Jewish side, because Kushner, his son-in-law, is the one acting as a negotiator for things like the Abraham Accords and peace agreements, all centralized around this kind of third temple and Israel theology for the end of time. And so go back and watch that, because it will help add context to what we're going to do here today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for watching Truth Matters and joining us. On this podcast, we talk about current events in connection with Bible prophecy. Now, if you want to take the things that we're talking about here, which is informing you of what's to come, because there is things coming. This New World Order is a real thing. And if you want to be ready, you're not going to want to miss subscribing to one of the other channels, which is How to Country. So make sure you go to the How to Country channel. We show you all sorts of country living techniques and how to be self-sufficient and how to have your own homestead with your self-sufficiency, growing your own food, and doing this without the influence of the system. So make sure you go and subscribe to How to Country. We'll see you there.
Now, these were the questions we initially laid out in the first episode and kind of touched on it on the second episode, but we want to answer all of these questions by the time we're done. We answered the first 4 of these questions in the last 2 episodes, kind of over the last 2 episodes, more the second one than the first one, because the first one we were just establishing the historicity of Daniel when it was actually written.
Yeah.
But now we're going to get into how each date, the command that they chose, and we'll talk about what that is if people forgot or maybe they're new here. We'll touch on that in a second. But how the command that's chosen by each worldview on this affects the start date and the end date, and how does it align with the various interpretations of what these things actually mean. So we're going to tackle this one today, and it's almost the whole episode's going to be on that one question. What command starts the clock? Now, what do people are saying, what do you mean, what command? And right after 924, in 925, it gives us, he says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, upon thy holy city. Then he gives us the next piece, which is, know therefore and understand from the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem. And so I think most people focus on the to build Jerusalem, and they think that the decree has to be building. But the restore is a very important note here, because the one thing that the Israelites would carry around everywhere, right? And it collapsed walls and conquered people without even them having to lift a finger. What were they carrying around?
The Ark.
The Ark. And what's inside of the Ark?
The 10 Commandments.
Okay, so to restore something to supremacy, and the central component of that supremacy is what sits inside of that Ark. To really have restoration for the city from God's point of view, there has to be something around those that law, that covenant that was basically what identified the Jewish people as different from the rest of the heathen nations.
Right. And this becomes probably one of the most critical points in all the different views, is when do we start this time frame?
Yes.
And what is the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild?
And in the last episode on this, not the last episode that just aired, but the last one on this, episode 2, we went through which 4 are the options and kind of loosely went through what everybody chose. Now we're going to get into what the consequences of making those choices are. And we saw that the Catholics choose the 4th decree, the evangelicals choose the 4th decree, the SDAs or Adventists, they choose the 3rd decree, and Judaism says no decree. So there were 4 decrees under consideration, because people will be like, 3rd decree, 4th decree, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
There were 4 main decrees, and I saw someone arguing for another decree that was made in the 1500s that we missed, and that it's actually based on the decree in the 1500s, and the eschatology that goes along with that. It just is a mess. So
1500 AD or
AD.
BC? Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was really poor theology. All respect to the person, but it's really poor theology. Almost the entire world that interprets this passage will admit that it has to be one of these 4. So,
well, it would have to be sometime shortly after Daniel or during Daniel.
Yeah.
So we have a little bit of a context there.
Yeah.
We can't shove it 2,000 years later after there has already been another temple built.
Yeah, the 70 AD temple, or the one that was destroyed in 70 AD being the second temple. Like, there are people who can always bring outlandish theories in. Somebody could say the decree was in 2000, you know what I mean? But it has to withstand the weight of evidence. And so we're just going to stick with the things that are generally accepted, and we believe that the proof is in one of these 4. But we're going to try to make it simple, which is the first 2 decrees, none of the 4 views allocate for the start of the 70 weeks. So we don't have to get too confused over if we need to include decrees 1 and 2. We are really zooming in on Artaxerxes, who is a Persian king,
which was actually Esther's husband.
Mm-hmm. And he had 2 separate decrees that we could choose from. So the Adventists choose the 3rd decree, which we're going to get in the future, and the evangelicals and Catholics point to the 4th decree, while the Jews say no decree. Now, why did the Jews say no decree? Because they have everything starting in 586 BC, and I have an asterisk next to that, because there is some discrepancy amongst Jewish scholars on when the real date of the destruction of the first temple was. And we're going to look at the consequences for that today as well. So we're zooming in on Judaism, no decree, because, we'll see here in a second, and then it starts in 586 BC or an alternative date. All groups agree that 70 weeks equals 490 years, so all we have to do now is do the math. Let's look at where the dates fall. Where does it go? Why does Judaism reject the first decree?
One of the reasons is that the word, they are translating that differently, and that's one of the big things that Jews do, is they make this barrier, like we've talked about before, of Hebrew versus English, and that your translation doesn't do it. And it says, the word of the Lord to the prophet Jeremiah, as mentioned above, in all the passages that mention some form of decree or proclamation concerning Jerusalem, none of them use the Hebrew word devar. Mm-hmm. And devar is that word that it's talking about.
Yep.
Therefore, the correct starting point of Daniel's prophecy must be associated with the issuing of a prophetic word and not a human decree.
Right. So this is the premise for the Jewish perspective of why none of the 4 decrees we just showed would work, because the words that they use generally with an earthly, human, kingly decree is not the word devar. But we actually challenged that in the last episode that we did on this, and said that there is one decree where you see the word devar in relation to one of the decrees. And we see that happened in Ezra chapter 7, verse 11. It says, "Now this is the copy of the letter that the king Artaxerxes gave unto Ezra the priest, the scribe, even a scribe of the words, the devar of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes." So this is why the word restore, and not just build, but restore was there, because this devar, coming from a authorized representative of God, was the the covenant, was the holy law that they were now allowed to go forth and teach and restore and put into action. It says Artaxerxes' first decree in 457 that it gave Ezra the authority to execute the judicial system based on the law of God and to freely teach it. Now, could you be Jerusalem, true Jerusalem, and be restored without being able to teach the law of God?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, so it's kind of this identifying marker that in the first two decrees, even if you started building, if you didn't have the ability to...
It has to be restored to its former glory and its former purpose.
Yes.
And what was being done there. So that would all have to be incorporated in here. And obviously here we do see that word devar used in the context, which maybe isn't the most extreme example of the argument for or against.
Yeah.
But they can't say that it wasn't used.
Yeah, and I imagine their rebuttal would be like, "Oh, he's just saying that Ezra is the one who has the devar, but he's the one that's able to go forth and teach the law in accordance with the decree." So technically, it is a representative of God taking God's law on his authorization and putting it back in. So it actually isn't as much about Artaxerxes' decree as it is about Ezra being able to execute what Artaxerxes allowed him to do, which is to bring the law back to Jerusalem.
Now, even because we've mentioned this before, even let's just assume that this isn't part of the argument. Now we'll look at some of the other details to see if, even if that is the case, that devar is not used and whatever, do the dates and the time frames match up, and is there any discrepancies there?
Exactly. So we're building a case, and most good lawyers wouldn't come into the case with like 1 point, throw it down, and be like, "That's all I got." So this is just one piece. There is a devar. It only is associated with one of the 4 decrees. But let's really, as you said, let's get in and start to see how each date affects the end result. So, what does the 70 weeks refer to? No human decree, but the prophecy must be 490 years to qualify.
Yeah.
All groups agree it has to be 490 years. And in the Jewish perspective, that is a continuous 490 years. Okay, what does Rabbi Kravitz say?
And again, this is Judaism's perspective. We're not saying that this is our perspective or the correct perspective, but this is what they think. So all the dates associated, the time frames, the events is the Judaism or Jewish view.
I am really glad you brought that up, because there will inevitably be people being like, "Is this what you guys think?" No, we are trying to teach you what others are thinking about it. So by the time we get to what we believe the right answer is, we have already...
We're being inquirers.
Yes.
We're looking into the information. We're letting them say their information, and then we're seeing if we can corroborate that.
And we're going to test all 4 views the same way. We're going to put the Adventist view under the same scrutiny test as the other ones. We're trying to treat them all equally based on how experts in their views say that it's supposed to happen. All right, so Rabbi Ben Kravitz. The angel Gabriel revealed to Daniel this additional understanding of the 70 years, extending them from 70 years to 70 weeks of years, stretching the time span to 490 years that span from the destruction of the first temple to the destruction of the second temple. Okay, we now have a really nice framework. We have 490 continuous years. The beginning date is the destruction of the first temple. The end date is the destruction of the second. So we should be able to put these things together.
It says that the starting date is the destruction of the first temple, but we're talking about a decree to restore and to rebuild. So that feels like the opposite to me. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because it's like to go forth to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and they're saying it's about the destruction of Jerusalem twice.
Yes.
So when does it start? Well, it starts with the first temple's destruction. That's what the rabbi said. Now the question is, when was the first temple destroyed? Now, almost all historical records, all historians that are secular or with one of the religious views have established, and even Jewish rabbis and scholars have established this to be 586 BC. we're going to see that that causes a problem. When does the 70 weeks end? It says at the second temple's destruction, which universally is agreed 70 AD. I have not been able to find even weird sources that would change that date from 70 AD.
That's a very solid historical event.
Yeah, it's like a rooted pillar in history that 70 AD was destruction of the second temple. So let's do simple math. I'm not a great math guy, but I think we can pull this basic math off.
Yeah.
And let's just start with the generally accepted 586 BC. All right, if we take 586 BC and take 490 continuous literal years with no break of 7 years, it puts us in 95 BC. There's a 166-year gap between the 95 BC and the year 70 AD.
When they say it should end.
Yes.
Because just simple math, if you look at 586, the number 586 is bigger than 490.
Yeah, you don't even get to AD.
So you don't even get to AD.
Yeah.
The switch of the date line there.
Yep.
And so we have a big discrepancy.
And we can just do the simple math of 586 and the 70 AD. That's 656 years. So there's no realm in which you could twist a 586 date to meet the specifications that the Jews have already set forth in their view. It has to be 490 literal years continuously, and it starts at the first and ends at the second temple destruction.
Unless you change history.
Unless you change history. So let's see what Rabbi Ben Zion Kravitz, how he solves this problem. And we just see here, does it fit the literal 490 years? No, it doesn't.
So this is from Rabbi Ben Kravitz again. Although there appears to be a discrepancy in chronology between the Jewish and secular Gregorian calendars of 166 years, which is exactly what we've seen.
Right. So let's pause there for a second. We just doing simple math. Let's say you never saw this. You would arrive at 166 years. He mentions the exact 166-year gap.
He acknowledges that.
So, and that's important because there may be people looking at that like, well, maybe they determine it a different way, or maybe what would he say about that? Well, what would he say is that there's a 166-year gap there. There's a problem. Hey guys, thank you for watching Truth Matters. We just wanted to jump in the middle of the program and ask if you've been impacted by the material that we put together here on this program, or by any of the programs that we do here at Amazing Discoveries, and it's in your heart to support this message, please take the time to donate. Every dollar matters. Every view matters. People have not heard this message yet, and the only way we can share it is with your support. So thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us reach other souls for Christ's kingdom.
With the secular dates earlier, it is clear that Jewish record keeping is more reliable and consistent concerning these events.
Okay.
Babylonian calendars changed arbitrarily with every new Babylonian king, and limited archaeological discoveries often reflect their arbitrary chronology. According to secular chronology, 586 BCE is the year incorrectly associated with the destruction of the first temple. So regardless of all the different historians and Babylonian chronology and everything else, he's basically saying that 586 is arbitrary and wrong just because they were poor at using the calendar.
He's saying flat out 586 is the incorrect date associated with the destruction of the first temple. And actually, we're getting a ton of information from this one quote, because he's saying the Jewish records are more correct, that Babylonians changed things, calendars arbitrarily, and that their 586 is incorrectly associated. Now, as we determine whether a statement is true or not, we have to acknowledge that anybody could write any article saying anything is not true. Yeah. It's not a matter of whether someone says it. It's a matter of whether what they say can be tested and weighed and judged, whether or not it's true against the larger weight of evidence. So now we have some things to weigh. The first one we're going to look at is if it's not 586 BC, when does the Jewish community say that the first temple was destroyed? And I'm telling you, I looked up and down and far and wide, and I contacted people in the Jewish community to try to find out if it's not 586, please just tell me so I can continue my investigation. And maybe there's somebody out there that can comment or send us something that gives me tangible proof of why it would not be 586, but here's all I could gather based on the information. According to some Jewish sources, the destruction of the first temple occurred on the 9th of Av. Now, I found a number of places citing the 9th of Av, but it never gave you a year of what year the 9th of Av was. And what it came down to is kind of this between years 3338 and 3341 AM. And AM just stands for Anu Mundi, which means in the year of the world. So they're trying to calculate from the beginning of creation to where we are today.
The amortized age of the world.
Yes. And so when we look at what is 3338 and 3341 in like normal, like secular Gregorian or Julian year counting, you find that it corresponds somewhere between 423 and 420 BC. So at least this gives us like a tangible window.
Yeah.
421, like...
And I just want to say again, that this is according to Jewish ideology, that 3338 and 3341 AM correlates to 423 and 420. So that is not a fact. We're not stating that as a fact. We're stating that that is what the Jewish time reckoning calculates it as.
Yeah, that's what gives us this window.
Yeah.
And we can still do simple math. So we can take 490 from 423 or 422 or 421. Which one would fit the destruction of the temple and 70 AD being the end date? And there's only one of those years. It would have to be 421 BC is the only year that would fit the 490-year prophecy from the first to second temple. This is simple math, right? So the question is 421 the real date of the destruction of the first temple? Because if it can be proven that it's not 421, then the entire idea that Rabbi Kravitz has proposed, that the calendars are bad and that the real date's something different, it falls apart entirely. So there's a problem with getting this 421 date. And I'm willing to be wrong and have somebody send us something. There is not a single authoritative Jewish source that cites what year it was. Not a single one. So how can we assume that they say it's 421? The only way we're making that assumption is because it's the only one that fits 490 years.
And that their chronology is more accurate even though they don't cite it.
Right.
In that way.
So where's your citation? Where's all these rabbis saying it wasn't really 586, it was 421, and then providing justification for it? And we're about to show why it is categorically impossible for the destruction of the first temple to be in 421 AD, BC, excuse me. And I hope people can appreciate, like, what we're trying to achieve here is allowing the evidence to just allow us to make a conclusion. Instead of being like, that's not right. Well, why is it not right? So why would 421 not work? The Bible gives us the answer on these things. In 2 Kings 25:2, it actually tells us which king was in charge at the destruction of the first temple and what year that king was. It says, and the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah.
Yeah.
So what we have to do is determine historically what was the 11th year of King Zedekiah.
Yeah.
And when we think about the destruction of Jerusalem, and a lot of times, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about Daniel. Daniel ended up, his whole story like began in Babylon, really.
Yeah.
Right? But he lived in Jerusalem. And so they were transported from Jerusalem to Babylon. And the best record for what happened there was the book of Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah lived through 4 separate kings during his time. Zedekiah was the very last one. Under the traditional understanding of where these kings fall, the 11th year of Zedekiah was 586 BC, right? And that's just based on Jewish records, historical records, archaeological evidence. So let's just say it wasn't really 586, it's 421. This creates a cascading effect of changing the dates for all these historical kingdoms.
All the events.
It changes all the events. It changes when Josiah, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah ruled. It changed when Jeremiah lived. It changed when Daniel gets to Babylon.
It changes the kingdoms of the world. Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece all have to be shifted hundreds of years in order for this to line up.
Well, let's see what happens to it. King Josiah would go from 609 to 475 to 444. Jehoiakim would have gone from 609 to 598 to 444 to 433 BC. Jehoiachin would go from 598 and 597 to 443 to 442. And Zedekiah would go from 597 to 586 to 432 to 421 BC.
Yeah.
That's a massive shift. Most of the world acknowledges that the kingdoms of Persia, when did Cyrus the Great rule generally? Around 500, in the 500 BCs, the early 500, like the 586, around that mid to early 500 BC era. Then he conquered Babylon in that time frame. This is saying Zedekiah wasn't even around till after the King Cyrus was dead. That's an impossible shift that would need a tremendous amount of historical evidence to shift that. Is that making sense?
And then Medo Persia's reign would either be shortened, or Rome's or Greece's reign would be shift forward or backwards. But we know that there's very good record keeping from many historians. I think we're referencing the chronology of Ptolemy, and it goes over the history here, and everything would have to be shifted out.
Everything, like Rabbi Kravitz can't just take the first temple and say, I'm going to put it here, without fundamentally shifting a whole bunch of history.
It would be like saying 9/11 didn't happen in 2001.
Yeah.
That's just because of, bad historical record keeping on the part of Americans. 9/11 actually happened
in 2017 or whatever.
Well, it would have to be like 2200.
Oh, right. If you're trying to match the 166-year difference.
Or it was in the 1800s, actually, that 9/11 happened. Yeah.
Right. And anybody could say that, but you'd have to provide so much evidence, and you don't have it. It's not there, right? And this trickle-down effect, it really gets bigger and bigger the more you look at it. So it's now the kings. We just spent a whole episode establishing that the book of Daniel was written in the 6th century BC.
Yeah.
Well, if the 11th year of Zedekiah, the year the temple was destroyed, was really 421 BC, and Daniel the prophet didn't go to Babylon until after the destruction of Jerusalem in 421, when was the book of Daniel written?
Have to be way later.
It would have to been at least 70 years after 421 BC.
Yeah.
Because in the beginning of chapter 9, in Daniel 9, he's talking about how he understands they're at the end of the 70-year captivity in Babylon. He's actively writing about that. That would mean that would be written in 421 BC. The whole historicity of him writing Daniel in the 6th century out the window. This would make the 6th century BC authorship impossible. And as we've said, it would change the time periods for Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, all the Persian kings. I mean, it's just a massive shift. And he offers it in the article, and we have the links always at the bottom of the articles. I recommend people go read it. He offers no explanation. He doesn't give you the date that it actually is. He said it's wrong, and Jewish calendars are better, but never gives you a date, never gives you any proof of where you can find that the date's changed, and never acknowledges that you have this cascading waterfall of historical problems when you move that date. So let's continue to determine what the Bible gives us to establish the chronology and where we are. Jeremiah 52, 12 and 13.
Now on the 10th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, who was in the service of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem, even every large house he burned with fire.
Okay, so the Bible's giving us information here that's extremely valuable. We need to understand what the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar was. Because if we have the first piece that we've just looked at, and we can say, okay, what's the 11th year of Zedekiah? Now, does that match with the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar? This is why the Bible provides so much wonderful detail that I'd say 90% of Christians just gloss over.
And most people think,
why
does it say this person begat them and then was ruling for this many years, and then this happened, then this many years, and then that happened? When I was first looking at it, I thought it was the most boring. Like, why is it even there? It doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
But it matters a lot.
Huge. It's tackling for problems like God knew that people thousands of years after these things were written were going to be using this book, and knew that details like this, as we're going to continue to see, it builds in the Catholic view and the evangelical view. It's the same premise. If you don't have these details, it's hard. You'll get lost in the fact that history is so long ago, and maybe it was this date and it could have been that date. But if we can establish when these reigns of these kings were, and I agree with him in part, there is great Jewish record keeping, and I don't think there's a Jewish record anywhere that would have all those 4 kings that Jeremiah lived in all the way in 400 BC and not 600 BC. So he's kind of self-defeating in that. But let's see if we can find out when the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign is. Now, in order to establish this, as you just touched on, we have this thing called the Canon of Ptolemy. Now, I didn't know a ton about this up until, a couple of years ago when I'm, diving into these things and wanting to learn and explore more. But the Canon of Ptolemy is one of the most accurate, highly respected historical records of ancient kings and kingdoms. Claudius Ptolemy was a highly respected astronomer, mathematician, and geographer in the 2nd century CE. The Canon of Ptolemy provides a list of kings and their reigns. Look at which kingdoms he covers. Now, this is before the Protestant world and all this stuff. We're identifying the 4 major kingdoms of the world. He did Babylon, Assyria, Macedonia, and Roman empires. That's Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome.
Yeah, if people don't understand what those words mean, Macedonia, that's the western part of the Grecian Empire.
Exactly.
It's just a different name
different name for Greece.
Over the centuries, titles change.
Yeah.
And that's just natural course of events.
But I found it fascinating that the 2nd century mathematician happens to pick the same 4 kingdoms that the book of Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, in a way, identify as the 4 major kingdoms of the world. So here is this highly sophisticated calendar that tells you the 4 major kingdoms of the world. And the way he did it was he tied astronomical events to specific eras of kings, helping create a meticulously accurate date of their rule. These records are extremely technical and precise. There's an example of it to the right here. This document is considered one of the most reliable sources in the world for the chronology of these kings and kingdoms. And I just want to kind of give a frame of reference. The very first king he starts with is King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 747 BC. So we're before even Nebuchadnezzar here. So he starts in 747 BC, and the last king that he charts ends in 161 AD with Antonius Pius. So people have heard of Pope Piuses. This is like in the Roman Empire. So he literally goes from 747 BC in an unbroken chain of kings through these major kingdoms and ends in 161 AD. That's impressive. And what he would do is, in the 5th year of Nebuchadnezzar, you had some astrological event like an eclipse that fixes these certain dates to certain times, because there weren't eclipses in that portion of the world at this date, at this time, at any other time except for this particular date. So this is why it becomes a relevant historical record. And what he would do was essentially give you the king Nebuchadnezzar and tell you how many years from that king the next king reigned and how long he reigned. So it was 137 years to Nebuchadnezzar, and he reigned for 37 years. And you can start doing calculations to determine where these things fall. He used astronomical calculations. By comparing the dates of these eclipses with the reigns of kings, Ptolemy created a highly accurate chronology. And this is the example I kind of just used. If an eclipse was recorded during the 5th year of the king's reign, Ptolemy could use his calculation to identify the specific date of that eclipse, thereby verifying the accuracy of both his astronomical models and historical records. And this is a continuous, unbroken chain through the 4 kingdoms of the world. So when does the Canon of Ptolemy place the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II? The canon states that Nebuchadnezzar II was from 605 to 562 BC, and this range is derived from the regnal years listed for him in the canon. So
Which would be way outside of our realm of what we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, certainly not in 400 BC, not 200 some odd years later, but this fits what the biblical record shows, what we understand to be correct.
Yes, what I meant was what we were seeing the Judaism view of 420 or 421.
Yes.
That would put the Canon of Ptolemy chronology way off.
Yeah, and you would have to basically provide a huge data set to say why the Canon of Ptolemy was wrong, because it's up to this point been one of the most accurate sources in human history on the topic. So let's see if Rabbi Kravitz what he's saying here is true. Did Babylonian calendars change arbitrarily? It says with limited archaeological evidence to reflect that. Again, anybody can say anything, but are these two statements true? Did they change them, and was there limited archaeological evidence? And the truth is, both of those statements are incorrect.
We're talking about the greatest world power at the time. We're not talking about some, little, state or little, entity who doesn't care about these things. This was a sophisticated world governing. It was the world power.
Hey everyone, Matt Schanche here with Truth Matters, and we need some help. Have you been impacted by Truth Matters or any of Amazing Discoveries programs? Well, now's the time to submit your resume. We're looking for video editors, motion graphics, or anybody who handles media type things. We could really use your resume. So go to the Amazing Discoveries website where we post all of our job postings and send us your resume. We'd love to hear from you. Hope you can be impacted by these programs and help us share the word and truth with all the world. Yeah, and I'm just going to read this little passage here, which talks about whether they changed calendars arbitrarily. Because what he's saying is with each king, they would start counting from the new king, but that's not an arbitrary change in the calendar. They were still very sophisticated astronomers in Babylon. I mean, the Chaldeans were hyper aware of the astrological happenings, and they would record journals and all sorts of stuff. But it says, while the Babylonians did use a dynastic dating system, their calendars did not change arbitrarily with each new king, and their archaeological discoveries reflect a sophisticated and systematic approach to chronology and astronomy rather than an arbitrary one. The Babylonians used a lunisolar calendar, which is based on the cycles of the moon and the solar year. They developed sophisticated mathematics and astronomical methods to keep their calendar in sync with the seasons, including the use of intercalary months. Moreover, the Babylonians maintained detailed astronomical records and had a continuous tradition of astronomical observations spanning several centuries. These records allowed them to refine their calendar and to make it more accurate over time. So the idea that they arbitrarily changed the calendars is, again, not something that's supported by history. And in fact, on the archaeological side, all the archaeological evidence points to a 500 BC reign of Nebuchadnezzar, 586 and before reign of Nebuchadnezzar. One of the main things was the Babylonian chronicles. This is a series of clay tablets that recorded major historical events from the reign of Babylon, including the destruction of Jerusalem, which we're going to take a look at here in a second. The astronomical diaries were a collection of clay tablets that contained detailed records of astronomical observations made by the Babylonian astronomers, which is why the Canon of Ptolemy knows there was a eclipse in the 5th year of this king in Babylon, was because they found all sorts of evidence to support this idea. And the last one is the Library of Ashurbanipal, discovered in Nineveh. This library contains over 30,000 clay tablets, including many important literary, historical, and scientific texts from the Babylonian periods. And all of these things, I would not say this is a small amount of data. It was quite a large amount of data that all points to a 500, 5th, 6th century BC reign, certainly not 421.
And these astrological events, like an eclipse or something like this, is very
discovered in Nineveh.
So we can look back at what was written about this king having, an eclipse in this year, and we can just extrapolate that backwards to see, okay, was this accurate? And yes, seems that all this lines up.
Yes, and you're going to have to really maneuver to try to make all of this information fit a later date narrative, because even secular archaeologists and historians wouldn't debate the 5th and 6th century historicity of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and the corresponding kingdoms as we know them today. So I want to give people an example of what the Babylonian Chronicle, what an entry looked like in the Babylonian Chronicles, because we're used to kind of the way the Bible reads. It gives us in the 5th month, in the 5th day, in the 7th month of the 11th year of this king. That's pretty detailed information. But what we find is the Babylonian Chronicles give us the same type of detailed information. And this particular passage is describing the attack by the king of Babylon on the city of Judah, and it corresponds exactly with what the Bible record says. So you have an extra biblical source, meaning an outside biblical source, confirming the same thing an internal biblical source is saying.
Yeah.
And this is how you get synergy. This is how you can establish historicity within the Bible. It becomes very important. So it says, in the 7th year, which would have been 597, 596, the month of Kislevu, the king of Akkad mustered his troops and marched to the Hatti land and besieged the city of Judah. And on the 2nd day of the month of Aduru, he seized the city and captured the king. He appointed there a king of his own choice. Now, this is important because most people don't really realize there were 2 attacks on the city. The first one happened in around 597, 596, probably more like 596, but you get into some number counting things when you ask people, but it's right there.
Yeah.
And then the second one, and that's about the time when Daniel, right? So there were 2 groups of people that got taken out of Babylon. Daniel was in, and his friends were in that first group here in 596. So the 2 Kings 24, 10 through 16 collaborates the exact record in the Babylonian chronicles, which speaks of it from a different side.
And that he would then appoint a king
Yes.
to be ruling there, which is a very strange thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very peculiar, very important point in corroborating these 2 accounts.
Yes, and it says, Nebuchadnezzar appointed Zedekiah as the new king of Judah. The event did not involve the destruction of the temple. So here we see that Jehoiakim gets taken out.
Yep.
And instead of Nebuchadnezzar just placing one of his Babylonian guys there, he thinks it's a better idea to get himself a Jewish stooge that will be his representative. And this is where Zedekiah comes in. And as we saw, the 2 Kings reference in the 11th year of Zedekiah.
Yep.
So that Babylonian chronicle was exactly right. They got rid of the first king, which would have been Jehoiachin, set up Zedekiah, and then like 10 years later, Zedekiah wasn't holding up his end of the bargain.
Yep.
And here comes Nebuchadnezzar back 10 years later. He besieges the city again in 588. And after a prolonged siege that lasted about 18 months, Jerusalem was finally captured in 586 BC. At that point, the temple was destroyed.
Yes.
Now imagine putting that in 421. Like it doesn't make any sense that you could have all of this historicity move so far into the future. It breaks the flow of time and events.
You'd have to nix off dozens of kings.
Exactly. And place them in weird times and weird places that just don't make any sense. So Zedekiah's 11th year corresponds perfectly with 586 BC. The 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar and the Canon of Ptolemy establishes this. The 2 accounts from the Babylonian chronicles and the 2 attacks against Jerusalem establish all of this. When Daniel went to Babylon in 596, we can establish that historically, and that fits the timing perfectly. So it really is putting a lot of pressure on Rabbi Kravitz's excuse that the 166-year gap that we come up with can be simply fixed by just putting the first temple destruction further into the future. And I will say that when I researched, I found more Jewish sources confirming a 586 BC destruction, because they're doing so, right? They're not thinking about the 70 weeks a lot of times, because there aren't a ton of Jewish sources handling the 70 weeks. In fact, I give Rabbi Kravitz credit for at least trying to tackle and explain each piece of this prophecy, because most aren't even touching it. So what they'll do, because they're not worried about the consequence of the 70 weeks, they're able to take the historicity and say, yes, here's an exact example. This is from the Bible Unearthed, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel and the Origins of its sacred texts. This is Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Sibelman. I hope I'm not butchering that too much. But these are 2 Jewish sources, and they say the kingdom of Judah survived more than a century longer, but its people could not avert the inevitable judgment of God. In 586 BCE, the rising, brutal Babylonian Empire decimated the land of Israel and put Jerusalem and its temple to the torch. So, the Jewish sources aren't even agreeing on this, but I would say 85 to 90% of Jewish people will say 586 was the right date.
And as Kravitz said, the Jewish chronology is much more accurate than the others. So 90% of them say it's 586.
Yeah. And the ones who say alternatively, they don't offer the date. They don't offer any explanation on how you have to shift the whole history. And I kind of hope somebody sends this to Rabbi Kravitz to please explain to us how you could possibly move all these kingdoms that far into the future for this first temple to be destroyed. So as we kind of review whether we can take this, we're just looking at the Judaism view. Does it stand the weight of scrutiny? Well, the historically accurate date for the first temple's destruction is in 586 BC, as I think we've proven unequivocally.
Even according to the other Jewish historians.
Correct, who are not really thinking about the 166-year gap there. But they can't deny the historicity. And I think the only reason Kravitz did it... Or should I say
Jewish rabbis, not historians?
Well, yes, but I'd say both. Historians, rabbis, scholars, they all agree, for the most part, 586. So establishing the 586 makes the application of the 490 years in relation to the time between the first and second temple impossible.
Right.
That's what we saw at the beginning.
166 years out, just like Kravitz said.
Exactly. And the fact that he acknowledges that the gap's there shows that we're not missing something in the process. Yeah. The alternative dates, such as 421 BC, lack any direct evidence and face substantial challenges when the reigns of the various kings from Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Israel are considered. It's just, as we looked at, it just shifts everything, impossibly shifts everything. And then this is something that we're going to see as a theme in all of them. He never makes the connection of the 2300-day prophecy to Daniel 8.
Right.
If you're not making that connection, your fundamental understanding of the prophecy can't be complete. And it's not a judgment, it's just a statement of fact. Like, if you're not connecting it, you couldn't be sharing the wholeness of the message from that prophecy no matter what you did.
But this is a big problem with not just this view, but most views in Christendom even, where we take a portion of something and we don't follow it through to its ultimate completion. And whether that's left behind theory or any of these others, because just like, if I can diverge for just a second, with left behind, it says there's going to be these two people, one taken and one left. And it's like, wow, we're going to be taken to heaven, so we want to be taken, right? Well, if we just read to the end of the passage, it explains it. It says, those that are taken where the eagles are gathered. So this is taken in judgment. This isn't taken to heaven where the eagles are eating dead bodies in heaven. So obviously, this is not the context there, and all you have to do is read to the end of the section. And same here. If we're looking at this 70 weeks isolated from the rest of the context, which is the 2300 days, chapter 8, and the vision in its entirety, then obviously we're going to start running into problems, which we have to take this in context.
And that's why I want each view to let's put it out there and put it under the test, because as we go through the prophecy, if we can invalidate a particular option along the way, then it's almost like you don't even need to spend time in looking at the other particulars after that, because we could go through the rest of the prophecy and show how they say, it doesn't say a Messiah will be cut off. It says the anointed, and the anointed is in relation to the temple and the high priest. Yeah. And instead of going and digging through all those weeds, the simple math application of what it means, either it's not about the first and second temple, and somebody's going to have to bring a new perspective from the Jewish view on what the 70 weeks is about, or it is, and it's been invalidated because the simple math doesn't work, and the explanation to move it in the future doesn't work. So now, from my point of view, there's no reason to continue looking at the Jewish view on this matter unless somebody comes and tells us that it's not about the destruction of the first and second temple, and there's some kind of weight of evidence behind that other than just lip service, which is kind of what we got from Rabbi Kravitz on this different alternative date for 421. So I'm going to say that based on this information, the final verdict on this view is it's incorrect, and that they acknowledge that there's the 166-year gap. So in their own admission that...
And there's no good body of evidence chronologically, historically, evidentially that is going to prove or be able to prove that date.
Exactly. And we're all open to seeing it, but you're going to have to make sure that the Canon of Ptolemy is proven to be incorrect, that all the historical records of the Persian kingdoms are incorrect.
The Bible chronology itself would have to be
changed
proven wrong.
Completely. The dates for Daniel, there's just so many consequences that I think it's safe from here on out to move on to the other views, because people will be like, oh, we didn't go through what they said the transgression is and making an end of sin.
But it's irrelevant.
It becomes irrelevant.
When your platform's wrong, if you are building a house and your foundation is all skewed, there's no sense in looking
building
at
your bathroom when your house is like this. Like, don't worry about your bathroom. Move on to a place that's got a good foundation. And so this is what our goal is here. There will be people who will be like, oh, but there's all these other pieces they didn't address. There's no point in addressing them if the very basis of it, by their own admission, doesn't add up.
When we get to a solid building block, then we can go to the next stage
piece,
and we can say, okay, does that line work? And then the next level, oh, does that one? Okay, no, we have a problem here. Do we have to look?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when we're looking at the four views and we see no decree and 586 BC, I think at this stage, unless somebody sends us an amazing amount of information that like offsets this, anybody who talks or witnesses to the Jewish people about this should walk them through the consequence of the dates that we've covered here today.
And then even just the fact that the decree is about rebuilding, it's not, I'm going to give you a start date and an end date of when the first destruction is and the second destruction is. It's kind of the reverse exactly of what the prophecy was intended to be.
To be a restoration and a rebuild, not a destruction. So I hope that makes sense for people. We're going to fill in the rest of these as we go through. But as of now, what ends the 70 weeks would be the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. And we see that doesn't fit the 490 years under the classic understanding of 586. Now, next, we're going to go into the Catholic view on this. Then we're going to go into evangelical, and we're going to end in Adventism. And we're going to put each under the same weight of scrutiny. And if the base doesn't add up, then there's no more time to waste on this. And I hope people can appreciate how we're trying to make this as straightforward as possible and not getting lost in all the weeds, because I can't tell you, I get like emails or messages with like 7 pages worth of ideas of how this is wrong, but they never address like your very basis is wrong. Unless we're going to get something new in understanding, which I haven't seen. The very basis is wrong, so why even bother with the rest of the details? And I'm interested to see what our brothers and sisters have to say about that. But next we're going into the Catholic view, and hopefully that'll be as enlightening as seeing what the Jewish view played out, where that leads us.
And this just shows again that if we're going to be good Bible students, we have to be good historical students too. You know, I wasn't always super interested in history, but as soon as you start looking at the Bible and comparing these things and seeing, you know, when you hear some of these names and they're weird for us now, we see like, even in the Bible, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and these names, it doesn't, click for us. But as soon as we start putting a timeline in here, and we see, okay, there was real events connected to this kingdom and that kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar II, and that's when that happened. And now you can make these correlations,
right?
And it becomes much more interesting. And we need to be good historical students, that we are studying history, because that is what really helps us to verify the prophecies and verify our understanding and even validate the Bible as a true prophetic book.
Exactly. And one of the, it says the spirit of the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. It's this beautiful gift. And people will be like, well, why are you going this in depth in the weeds on this? Because it's affecting so many people. Because there's a whole political movement to instill ideologies based on a wrong understanding of a prophecy. This is why it becomes, even on the Jewish side, the evangelical and the Jewish side, it's absolutely critical. And hopefully this gives tools for people to constructively and in a brotherly Christ-like fashion be able to share this information, because we're certainly not attacking them. We're simply saying, why doesn't this add up?
Right.
Could you tell me why there's a gap here? Oh, sure, the dates changed. Well, could you prove to me why the dates changed? Because here's this, and this that establishes that date. So this is what I think. Let's reason together. it should be. And our job here on Truth Matters is to give people the tools to look into it themselves. Go look at the Canon of Ptolemy. Go look and see if you can establish these other dates. Go look at what all the Jewish perspectives you can find to see if what we're saying is wrong or incorrect or we misunderstood. Because even if we were, we want the catalyst to be people to be interested enough to be like, hey, is that really how it is?
And look into these things.
That's right. That's right. And if we do, and it helps us come closer to our Savior, and it helps us not be deceived for the stuff that's coming at the end of time, well then, by God's grace, we've done our job here to help engage people in something that we think is critically important to understand for the end of time.
And it's really important that everybody does this with a humbleness, nothing to prove, but just everything to learn.
Yeah.
And I hope that all the viewers who watch this were able to definitely learn something today. And if you haven't seen our last video where we were talking about Trump and the NRB, go to the last podcast. And if you want to see the next one, which is about the Catholic view on the 70 weeks, also go to adtv.watch, because that episode will come out before it comes out on YouTube. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next Truth Matters.